Welcome to our deep dive today.
Okay.
We're going to be taking on Psalm 37.
Okay.
It's a piece of wisdom literature that tackles a really age-old question.
Yeah.
Why do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah.
And on the flip side, why do those who do wrong seem to get ahead? It's something I think we've all pondered at some point.
Yeah. It's fascinating how Psalm 37 doesn't shy away from those tough questions.
Right.
It really acknowledges that struggle
Yeah.
of seeing injustice and trying to reconcile that with faith.
Yeah.
And I think you can almost feel the raw emotion in the text.
Yeah. And right from the start, it tells us not to envy evildoers.
Yeah,
Easier said than done right.
absolutely.
Especially when you see folks cutting corners and seemingly reaping the rewards.
Yeah.
It can really make you question everything.
But here's where Psalm 37 gets really interesting.
Okay.
Instead of just saying, don't worry, it'll all work out,
Right.
it uses powerful imagery.
Right.
Like, it compares the wicked to grass that withers quickly.
Oh, wow.
It's a reminder that appearances can be deceiving.
Yeah.
And what seems like success right now might be fleeting.
So you're saying we shouldn't focus on outward appearances at all?
Exactly. The opening verses of Psalm 37, verses 1 through 8, are all about trusting in the Lord
Okay.
and finding our security in something much deeper than fleeting material success.
Yeah, it's encouraging us to play the long game, to focus on cultivating our integrity and trusting that God will handle the rest,
Yeah.
even if it doesn't feel like it's happening fast enough.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The psalm definitely emphasizes patience and waiting for God's timing.
Yeah.
Verse 7 specifically says, wait patiently for the Lord. Wait confidently for him. Do not fret over the apparent success of a sinner, a man who carries out wicked schemes.
But waiting can be so hard, especially when you feel like you're being treated unfairly or you're surrounded by people who don't seem to be playing by the rules.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And Psalm 37 acknowledges this difficulty.
Okay.
It doesn't dismiss our feelings of frustration
Yeah.
or disillusionment,
Right.
but it reminds us that God sees everything,
Okay.
and ultimately, he will act.
Okay, so we've got this idea of trusting in God
Yeah.
and waiting patiently.
Yes.
But the psalm doesn't stop there, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
In fact, things get even more intense when we move into verses 9 through 15 and verse 20.
Okay.
Here, Psalm 37 paints a stark contrast
Yeah.
between the fate of the righteous and the wicked.
Okay.
And it doesn't sugarcoat anything.
It's pretty graphic, right?
Definitely.
It talks about swords piercing hearts and enemies vanishing like smoke.
Yes.
Those are some pretty powerful images.
Powerful images.
Mhm.
And I think what's interesting here is how Psalm 37 ties these images to the concept of ultimate justice.
Okay.
It's suggesting that even if we don't see justice play out in our everyday lives,
Right.
there will be a final reckoning,
Yeah.
a time when God sets everything right.
Right. So what does this cosmic reckoning look like exactly? I mean, when we're talking about the wicked being wiped out,
Sure.
is this a literal destruction?
Yeah.
Or is it something more metaphorical?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that's been debated by theologians for centuries.
Right.
There are certainly interpretations that focus on a very literal physical destruction of the wicked.
But for someone listening who might not subscribe to that kind of interpretation, what other ways could we understand the destruction of the wicked?
There are also interpretations that emphasize a more spiritual or metaphorical understanding of destruction.
Okay.
For example, some scholars see it as a separation from God,
Right.
a kind of spiritual death or exile.
It makes you think about what's really meant by the land in the Old Testament.
Yeah,
The righteous inheriting it? Maybe that signifies something beyond just physical territory.
exactly. In many instances, the land can be seen as a symbol of God's blessing,
Okay.
of peace, abundance, and right relationship with him.
So the wicked being removed from the land could represent their separation from those blessings, a state of spiritual desolation.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting perspective. It makes you think about how these ancient texts can speak to us on multiple levels, even if we don't take everything literally.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of the beauty and power of Psalm 37.
Yeah.
It invites us to engage with these complex ideas
Right.
and to grapple with the big questions of justice, righteousness, and the ultimate fate of humanity.
So we've explored this idea of trusting in God even when it feels like injustice is prevailing.
Yes.
And we've seen the stark contrast the psalm paints between the fate of the righteous and the wicked.
Right.
But what about those who do trust in God and strive to live uprightly?
Yes.
What awaits them?
That's a great question, and it leads us into a much more hopeful and encouraging part of Psalm 37. Well, Psalm 37 doesn't leave us hanging. It jumps into verses 16 through 19, then 21 through 24 and 29.
Okay.
And it really paints a beautiful picture of what's in store for those who walk the path of righteousness. And it's not just vague promises either. We're talking about specific, tangible blessings.
Okay, so you've got my attention. What kinds of blessings are we talking about?
Well, first off, there's a sense of security, like being anchored to something much bigger than yourself.
Okay.
The psalm talks about the righteous being established their steps firm.
Yeah.
It's like having this unshakable foundation, even when the world around you feels chaotic.
That's a powerful image, especially in times like these when so much feels uncertain. What else does the psalm highlight?
Well, there's this beautiful promise of provision, of always having enough, even in the face of scarcity.
Wow.
Psalm 37 even mentions provision during famine, which speaks to a deep level of trust and reliance on God's care.
It reminds me of that line from verse 16, "The little that a righteous man has is better than the riches of many wicked."
Yes.
It's like a value shift, a reminder that true wealth isn't measured by material possessions.
Exactly. It's about finding contentment and abundance in our relationship with God, rather than chasing after fleeting material gains.
You know, for me, one of the most comforting aspects of Psalm 37 is this idea of guidance, of not having to navigate life's twists and turns alone.
Yes, that's a key theme throughout the psalm.
Yeah.
The righteous are described as being led by God, their paths made straight.
Right.
It's this beautiful image of walking hand in hand with a loving guide who knows the way.
And of course, there's the promise of protection that God is watching over those who trust in him.
Yes.
It doesn't mean we'll be exempt from challenges,
Right.
but we can face them with confidence knowing that we're not alone.
And speaking of tangible examples of God's faithfulness, we can't overlook the story that's shared in verse 25. I was young and now I am old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread.
That's such a powerful testament to God's enduring love and care for his people, even through generations. It speaks to the long view that Psalm 37 encourages us to take.
Right. It's about trusting that God's faithfulness extends beyond our immediate circumstances.
Right.
That his goodness is woven into the very fabric of our lives.
This is all incredibly encouraging, but I imagine some listeners might be thinking, okay, so God provides and protects, but do we just sit back and wait for it all to happen?
Right.
Or is there a role for our own effort for actively shaping our destiny?
You've hit on a really important point. And this is where we move into a section of Psalm 37 that gets very practical.
Okay.
Verses 26 through 28 and 30 and 31 really dive into the nitty-gritty of righteous living.
Okay.
It's not just about passively waiting, but actively aligning our actions with God's will.
So what does this active alignment look like? What are some of the qualities that Psalm 37 highlights as being characteristic of the righteous?
But compassion is huge. Verse 26 describes the righteous person as being constantly compassionate and lending freely.
Okay.
It's not just about avoiding wrongdoing, but actively seeking to alleviate suffering and make a positive impact on the world around them.
That resonates deeply with me, especially in today's world where there's so much pain and division. It's like a call to be agents of healing and reconciliation.
Exactly. And there's also this emphasis on generosity, a willingness to share what we have, even when it feels like we don't have much to give.
Yeah.
It's interesting how Psalm 37 contrasts this generosity with the behavior of the wicked who borrow but don't repay.
It speaks to a deeper principle of reciprocity, of recognizing that we're all interconnected and our actions have ripple effects. What other qualities does this psalm emphasize?
Well, wisdom plays a central role. Verse 30 tells us that the mouths of the righteous utter wisdom and their tongues speak what is just. It's about making decisions based on discernment, understanding, and a deep alignment with God's principles.
It's not just about being book smart, but about cultivating a heart of wisdom,
Right.
a deep knowing that guides our actions and shapes our character.
Absolutely. And then verse 31 explicitly connects this wisdom to God's law. The law of their God is in their hearts. Their feet do not slip. It suggests that true wisdom is rooted in a deep understanding of God's moral order and aligning our lives with his purpose and will.
So how do we cultivate this kind of wisdom in our own lives? What does it look like to turn away from evil and pursue righteousness in a world that often feels morally ambiguous?
It's a great question, and I think it starts with honesty and self-reflection.
Okay.
It's about asking ourselves tough questions. Where am I tempted to compromise? Where do I need to make changes in my thoughts, words, and actions to better align with God's principles?
It's like an ongoing process of refinement, of chipping away at the rough edges and striving to become more Christ-like in all that we do.
Exactly. It's about cultivating those qualities of compassion, generosity, and wisdom that Psalm 37 holds up as ideals.
And it's important to remember that living righteously doesn't make us immune to challenges. In fact, verses 32 and 33 talk about the wicked plotting against the godly, seeking to bring them down.
That's a sobering reminder that the path of righteousness isn't always smooth sailing.
Right.
There will be times when we face opposition, when we're targeted precisely because of our commitment to what's right.
But even in those moments, the psalm reminds us that we're not alone. It says, "The Lord will not leave them in their power, or let them be condemned when brought to trial."
And that leads us beautifully into the final section of Psalm 37, which focuses on God's active involvement in protecting and delivering the righteous.
So we've talked about all these blessings of righteousness, and we've acknowledged that, choosing that path doesn't mean life will be easy.
Right.
It sounds like this final part of Psalm 37 dives into how God actively works in the lives of those who follow him.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Verses 34 through 40 are all about God's protection and deliverance.
Okay.
And it starts with this very clear instruction in verse 34. Hope in the Lord and keep his way. It's like an active call to put our trust in God.
Okay.
And to really live according to his principles.
So it's like more than just hoping for a good outcome.
Yeah,
It's actively aligning our lives with God's will.
Exactly.
And trusting that he'll work everything out.
Exactly. And then the song goes on to promise that, if we do this, God will exalt us to inherit the land. And here again, we see that idea of the land as representing more than just physical territory.
Right.
It symbolizes God's blessing, a place of peace, security, and abundance.
And it's interesting how Psalm 37 contrasts this inheritance with the fate of the wicked.
Yes.
It uses this vivid image in verse 35 of the wicked flourishing like a green tree in its native soil.
Right.
But then in a sudden twist.
Yeah, verse 36 hits us with, he passed away, and behold, he was no more. Though I sought him, he could not be found.
Wow.
It's this stark reminder that outward success can be so fleeting,
right,
like a mirage that disappears when you get close.
It really challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and to really consider what true lasting success looks like.
And I think that's precisely the point that Psalm 37 is driving at.
Okay.
Verse 37 says, mark the blameless and behold the upright, for there is a future for the man of peace. It's about recognizing that true fulfillment comes from aligning our lives with God's will.
Right.
From cultivating those qualities of righteousness that we talked about earlier.
So even in the face of opposition and uncertainty, we can find peace in knowing that God is actively involved in protecting and guiding those who trust in him.
Absolutely. And, the psalm really drives this point home in those final verses.
Oh.
It assures us that the Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him.
So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into Psalm 37, what are some key takeaways that you hope listeners will walk away with?
I think one of the most powerful messages is that we don't have to be consumed by anxiety or fear, even when we're surrounded by wickedness and injustice.
Yeah.
We can find refuge and peace in that truth, that God is ultimately in control.
Right.
And his justice will prevail.
It's a call to trust, isn't it? To trust in God's timing, his provision, and his ultimate plan for our lives, even when we don't fully understand it.
Absolutely. And I think it's also an invitation to embrace a different definition of success.
Okay.
One that prioritizes eternal values over temporary gains.
Right.
True fulfillment, as Psalm 37 shows us, comes from walking in righteousness, cultivating compassion, generosity, and wisdom, and trusting that God will be our guide and protector every step of the way.
Well said. Psalm 37 is truly a rich and multifaceted text.
Yes, it is.
It challenges us to grapple with some of life's biggest questions.
It does.
And offers timeless wisdom for navigating the complexities of our world.
Yes.
If this deep dive has resonated with you, I encourage you to revisit Psalm 37 and just let its words sink in. Who knows what new insights you might uncover? Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.